An 84-year-old black veteran was shoved to the ground outside a bar while the town watched in silence. No one helped. No one moved. But 30 minutes later, a Black Hawk helicopter tore through the New Mexico sky. And what happened next made an entire city stop breathing. This isn't just about one man. It's about who we become when we think no one's watching. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story. It is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share what you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. They saw him every Thursday. An old man with dark skin and a limp, walking past the same row of sandstone buildings in downtown Santa Fe like clockwork. Always at 230. Always with a bag from Mara's Deli in one hand and a cane in the other. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He just walked, steady, quiet, like someone carrying something heavier than time. To most, Leonard Len Booker was. Invisible, just another relic moving through the tourist town haze. But not to everyone. Some people look at a man and see his clothes, his posture, the worn soles of his boots. Others look and see a threat, a target, a reminder of something they spent their lives trying to forget. That afternoon, the air was thick with dust and late summer heat. Music bled from the open doors of El Gallo Rojo, a biker bar 2 blocks from the cathedral. The laughter inside was sharp, jagged, like something meant to cut. A line of chrome-plated motorcycles shimmered along the curb, each one polished like a weapon, idle and gleaming in the sun. Len didn't look at them. He never did, but as he passed a third bike, a Harley with a custom Red Eagle on the tank, his coat caught the handlebar, just barely. The mirror wobbled. The bike rocked half an inch. He stopped instantly. "Sorry, son," he said, turning to the open doorway. His voice was low and even. "Didn't see I was that close." The words were simple. The tone was calm, but they weren't enough. A man emerged from the bar, tall, red-haired, thick-armed with a vest that screamed bluster more than brotherhood. His name was Chase Delroy, and if there was one thing Chase hated, more than being contradicted, it was being made to look small, especially by a man who reminded him of everything his grandfather used to curse at the dinner table. "You touch my ride." "Old man." Chase's voice was too loud, theatrically aggressive. Len raised a hand. "Wasn't a touch, just a graze. I already said sorry," but Chase didn't want an apology. He wanted an audience. The music from the bar faded as a few heads turned. One man stepped outside, beer still in hand. Another pulled out a phone. A woman laughed nervously. "Maybe you ought to stay on the sidewalk next time," Chase said, stepping closer. "Or better yet, stay home. Don't need no war relic stumbling around like he owns the place." He was inches away now. Len could smell the whiskey on his breath, feel the heat off his skin. He tightened his grip on the cane, but didn't move. "Back off," Len said evenly. "You've made your point." But Chase hadn't made his point. Not yet. With a suddenness that silenced everything, he shoved Len hard in the chest. The bag from Mara's Deli hit the ground. A loaf of sourdough rolled into the gutter. The cane clattered against the curb. Len went down hard, shoulder and hip, first one knee twisting underneath him. He didn't cry out, but the sound of his body hitting pavement was louder than any siren. A slow hush fell over the sidewalk. Chase stood over him, smirking. "Bet they didn't teach you balance in the damn army." From the ground, Len looked up, blood seeping from a cut near his temple. His hat knocked sideways, but his eyes weren't afraid. They were focused. He didn't yell. He didn't beg. He reached into his coat and pulled out a battered old cell phone. No touchscreen, just buttons. He hit one. A name flashed on the tiny display. Iron no priority. Then he put the phone away, adjusted his hat, and began to rise. You good old man, someone jeered from the bar doorway. Len didn't answer. He retrieved his cane, slowly, brushed off his pants, and picked up the flattened loaf of bread. He sat on the bus bench, like nothing had happened. But something had, because 30 minutes later, the sky answered the call. It began as a low vibration, barely, audible over the wind. Then the sound grew, rotors slicing through air with the fury of a memory awakened. Tourists stopped. Locals stepped out of shops. Phones turned skyward. Over the distant hills came a shadow, fast, deliberate, descending like judgment. A Black Hawk helicopter. Screams erupted as people scattered from the plaza. The bird came in low, kicking, up dust, rattling windows, setting off car alarms. Behind it, from 2 side streets came matte black SUVs moving in formation, tires screeching as they cornered and stopped outside the bar. 12 figures stepped out. No insignia, no smiles, just silence and precision. Helmets, tactical vests, eyes scanning. Everything. No one had to say who they were. The town already knew. And then from the heart of the helicopter stepped a man in charcoal gray fadings. Major Desmond Booker. Tall, broad, calm, like the sea before storm. He didn't carry a weapon. He didn't need one. The crowd parted. The town held its breath. He walked to the bench where Lynn sat, and without a word knelt in front of him. He wiped a smear of blood from his father's cheek with the sleeve of his glove. You called, he said. Lynn nodded. Didn't want noise. Just respect. Desmond rose slowly. Then he turned. The bar had gone silent. Chase stood, frozen just outside the door, the bravado on his face curdling into panic. He'd struck a man. Not just any man, a soldier, a father. And now the sky had come for an answer. The dust hadn't even settled when the first whispers began. It was the kind of stillness that didn't belong to Santa Fe, a city known for its color, for its movement, for its sun-drunk streets. But in that moment, as Major Desmond, Booker stood face to face with a man who had shoved his father to the ground. Silence swallowed the plaza whole. No one knew what would happen next, but everyone knew they were watching something that wouldn't be forgotten. Chase Delroy, still standing outside the bar in his sleeveless denim vest and mirrored sunglasses, had started to sweat. He had thought this would be over with a laugh of beer and maybe a story to retell at his next rally. Instead, he was staring into the kind of calm that only men who'd seen the worst of the world could wear without. Flinching, Desmond didn't speak. He didn't threaten. He just looked, and Chase knew. He stepped back instinctively, the tough kayak crumbling by degrees. The crowd shifted. A few phones caught the moment. Not the moment a man got put in his place, but the moment he saw himself for the first time in the reflection of someone else's discipline. Len didn't move from the bench. His eyes followed, his son unreadable. There was no pride on his face, no vindication, just the heavy quiet of a man who had lived long enough to know that justice, when it comes, often speaks in hush rather than noise. Desmond finally turned to the tactical unit behind him and gave a signal, barely a flick of his wrist. The team didn't draw weapons. They didn't advance. They simply stood their ground, forming a living barrier between the old man and the world that had tried to ignore him. Stand down, Desmond said, his voice firm but low. Then he faced the onlookers. My name is Major Desmond Booker, he said, Unstates Army. I didn't come here with threats. I came here because my father, Sergeant Leonard Booker, decorated veteran of Korean War and the African border conflicts, was assaulted in broad daylight, and not a single person stepped forward. He let that hang in the air. It wasn't a rebuke. It was a mirror. My father served this country before. Most of you were born. He bled for it, buried friends for it, and today he got knocked to the ground outside a bar while carrying a bag of bread, and no one helped him. A woman in the crowd began to cry. Quietly, an older man removed his hat. Desmond looked down for a moment, the weight of his own fury tempered by the need to lead, not punish. I'm not here because he's fragile, he continued. I'm here because he shouldn't have to stand alone. A slow murmur rippled through the crowd. Something inside people shifted. You could feel it. Guilt, shame, recognition. But something else, too. Resolve. Someone in the back whispered, "That's the man who used to fix the church roof for free." Another said, "He coached my nephew's little league. Never asked for a dime." The murmurs grew louder, less about what happened and more about who it had happened to and why it should never have happened at. Oh, Chase Delroy tried to disappear into the doorway of the bar, but it was too late. One of Desmond's men stepped forward, not aggressively, just intentionally, and handed a small device to the local police chief who had just arrived on scene. It was a digital recorder. Inside the playback was crystal clear's voice laughing. His slap to fall, the taunt about war relics. The chief listened, turned pale, and nodded. Chase was cuffed 5 minutes. Later, not by soldiers, but by his own city. As the cruiser pulled away, Desmond knelt once more by his father. "You okay?" Old man Lynn looked at him, one eyebrow raised. "Took you long enough." Desmond exhaled, something like a laugh. "You didn't call me to come beat him up." "No," Len said, finally standing. "I called you so you'd remind this place that silence isn't neutral. It always picks a side." That night, the video reached the internet. It wasn't flashy, no dramatic music, no editing tricks, just raw footage. Desmond's speech, Len's steady dignity, the confrontation, and most powerful of all, the way the wind carried Desmond's words through a crowd that had forgotten how to listen. By midnight, it was on veterans forums. By morning, it was national news. And by the next day, something remarkable happened. Not a protest, not a riot, but an invitation. The mayor of Santa Fe herself, the daughter of a World War II medic, called. Desmond personally. She didn't offer apologies. She offered space. "We'd like to host a community gathering," she said, "on the plaza, for your father, for what he represents." Len said no at first. "This ain't about me," he told Desmond. "I'm just an old man with a limp and a cane." Desmond shook his head. "No, Dad, you're a line in the sand." 3 days later, the city announced a public teach-in. Veteran students, families, everyone was welcome. No speeches prepared, just stories, memories, a reckoning shared under the same sky that had once echoed with helicopter blades. The event would be called The Call Heard Through the Wind, and Len Booker reluctantly but quietly agreed to sit on that same bench again, this time surrounded by a different kind of army, one that didn't wear uniforms, one that came not to fight, but to remember, to listen, and finally to stand. It was supposed to rain that Saturday, but instead, the sky stayed dry, as if it too was holding its breath. At 4:40 p.m., sharp the plaza in Santa Fe filled with folding chairs, a small podium, and an unassuming wooden bench that had quietly become the epicenter of something much larger than a single act of violence. There were no banners, no confetti, no loud music, just the sound of shuffling feet, whispered conversations, and the distant hum of traffic on Cerrios Road. And yet there was tension in the air. Not fear, not chaos, but the kind of charged stillness that happens when truth is about to land, and no one knows exactly how hard. Len Booker arrived early. He walked slower now. His cane tapped rhythmically against the brick, and though his steps were steady, there was something behind his eyes, a mix of weariness and clarity, like a man who'd carried too many battles, but chose to show up anyway. Desmond walked beside him, dressed not in uniform, but in a simple black shirt and slacks, his posture a silent shield. The soldiers who had descended from the Black Hawk days earlier were absent. This was not their fight now. It belonged to the people. As Len settled onto the same bench, the one where he'd fallen, bled, and been ignored, someone in the crowd began clapping. One pair of hands at first, then another, then a ripple, then a wave. Len didn't stand. didn't raise a fist. He just nodded once in the direction of the applause. It wasn't for pride. It was for survival. His presence, his insistence on not disappearing into the background had become a kind of defiance few had expected. Desmond took the podium first. He spoke, briefly, not about the assault, but about lineage, about what it meant to inherit silence and to break it. He didn't list medals. He told stories about how his father once fixed a stranger's truck in the middle of a storm, refusing to take money, about how he used to iron Desmond's ROC uniform the night before every inspection, saying, "Respect is stitched in the details." The crowd listened not with their ears, but with their breath, still, focused, waiting for what would come next. Then, something unusual happened. A young woman stepped forward, uninvited but not unwelcome. She introduced herself, Leah Martinez, a high school senior, Latina, daughter of a Vietnam vet. She had been inside the diner the day Len was struck. She had seen it all and done nothing. "I didn't freeze because I didn't care," she said, voice trembling. "I froze because I was afraid I'd be next. And I'm sorry." She turned to Len, hands slightly raised, not in defense, but in surrender. "I should have helped you, but I won't make that mistake again." There were no gasps, no dramatic music, just raw, unpolished truth spoken in public. It was the beginning of something no one had put on the schedule reckoning. More people followed. A store clerk who had turned his back, a delivery driver who had recorded the incident but hadn't turned the video in, even the bartender. From the Red Crest, the same bar Chase Delroy had stumbled out of, came forward. "I was told to say nothing," he confessed. "They said it would blow over, that he was just some old guy." Then he looked directly at Len. "But you weren't some old guy. You were the mirror we were afraid to look into." And just like that, the event stopped being a teach-in. It became a tribunal of conscience. The most powerful moment, however, didn't come from words. It came from the sky. At precisely 5:43 p.m., as Desmond returned to the bench beside his father, the distinct low thrum of rotors echoed. Once again, the sound pulled every head toward the horizon. A second Black Hawk approached, not descending fast this time, but circling, low and slow over the plaza, trailing a single long banner behind it. 3 words, "We see you." No one cheered. They just watched. It wasn't a government message. It wasn't military ordered. It was personal, coordinated by Desmond's unit, funded by their own pockets. Because what had happened to Len wasn't a news cycle. It was a legacy interrupted, and they wanted to write it back into history. Children pointed, elders nodded solemnly, and for a long, suspended moment, even the trees around the plaza seemed to stand taller. Afterward, people lingered, not to take selfies, not for spectacle, but because something had shifted. A former firefighter invited Len to speak at a civic leadership class. A nurse asked Desmond how to start a local veterans honor board, and perhaps most poignantly, a Black father and his son approached quietly. The boy was maybe 10. He held a hand-drawn card on it, in shaky crayon letters. "Thank you for not giving up." Len smiled for the first time that day. Not wide, not boastful, just enough. As the sun began to dip behind the stucco skyline of Santa Fe, casting long golden rays across the plaza, Desmond leaned toward his father and asked, "Was it worth it coming here again?" Len looked at the now crowded square the faces once averted, now drawn toward him. "I think," he said slowly, "the sky just took our side." And in that moment, every pain, every silence, every second of being overlooked, it felt, even if briefly, like it had been answered, not with vengeance, but with visibility, with truth, and with a wind that now carried a different kind of sound, echoes not of helicopters, but of healing. In the days following the plaza gathering and the message drawn in the sky, the streets of Santa Fe looked unchanged. The buildings were the same sun-streaked adobe. The same market vendors sold silver bracelets and turquoise rings. The same breeze stirred dust along the sidewalks. But people looked longer now. Some nodded. Some avoided eye contact altogether. And some, like the young couple who passed Len Booker near the cathedral steps and quietly said, "Thank you," were beginning to see the difference between looking and witnessing. Len wasn't seeking recognition. He never had. He still walked the corner store on Wednesdays, still ordered the same. Coffee, black, no sugar, from the diner where half the town had once chosen to stay seated while he bled on the street. He still used the same cane. The bruises had faded. The limp had not. What had? Change wasn't how he walked. It was how they stood around him. Some made space. Some kept their distance. But almost no one ignored him now, and that somehow was heavier than the silence that came before. At home, Desmond sat at the dining table with his father every evening. They didn't always talk. They didn't need to. Sometimes Desmond read aloud letters that had begun arriving, handwritten, typed, sometimes folded into uneven thirds. One came from a teacher in Atlanta, another from a Marine widow in Des Moines, one from a 12-year-old girl who wrote, "I showed your video to my class, and now we're all writing about dignity." Desmond kept them all in a box labeled Echoes. Len never opened it. "They're not for me," he said. "They're for the silence." But not everyone welcomed the sound that silence had left behind. The Red Crest bar was closed temporarily for renovations, though the cracked window and paint-smeared slurs on the back alley said otherwise. No one claimed responsibility. No one filed a report. People simply murmured, "Actions have consequences." And Chase Delroy, he'd vanished. Rumor was he'd left town. Someone said they saw him outside Amarillo working construction. Another claimed he'd been fired from his job and moved in with a cousin. But in truth, no one wanted to claim him. Not the bar, not the town, not even those who had laughed alongside him. Yet even without him present, his absence left a shadow. At church during a Sunday service, the pastor paused midsmon to say, "Forgiveness is holy, but accountability is sacred." There was no applause, just an echoing stillness that wrapped the sanctuary tight. At the local high school, a history teacher added a new lesson to the curriculum. Modern civic courage, it read. Len's face was never mentioned, but everyone understood. And in the quietest corners, between aisles of the grocery store, under bleachers at the ball field, people whispered about the day the sky chose a side. Not everyone agreed. Not everyone changed. But now, they had to talk around the truth, not over it. One afternoon, Desmond came home to find his father sitting in the backyard, cane resting on the grass beside him, eyes fixed on something, invisible in the distance. The New Mexico light made everything look older, cracked, golden, haunted. The air smelled like dust and pine. "They mailed me an award," Len said, holding up a manila envelope. Inside was a plaque from a local Veterans Council for Community Valor. "You gonna hang it?" Desmond asked. Len shook his head. "I didn't earn it for being brave. I earned it for not disappearing." He handed it to his son. "You keep it. You're the one who made sure someone was still watching." But Desmond didn't hang it either. He placed it on the mantel, next to a photo of his mother. Long passed and said nothing more about it. Weeks passed. Then came the town meeting. This time it wasn't held in a church. It was called by the city council official public and impossible to ignore. Flyers had been posted, email sent, civic listening forum. The headline read, "For reflection, response, and repair." Len didn't plan on going. "I've already said my piece," he told Desmond. But that evening, he put on his pressed shirt anyway, brushed off his jacket, cleaned his cane. The auditorium was crowded, not overflowing, but present. Town officials, local activists, teachers, bartenders, veterans, teenagers, everyone whose life had brushed against the story, either directly or through the thousands of view shares and comments it had sparked online. Len didn't speak. He didn't have to. Others did. A white woman in her 60s who admitted she had crossed the street when she saw him walking. A young black man who said I didn't grow up here. I came here hoping it would be different. An older Latino business owner who had grown up during the Zoot Suit riots and said this ain't new, but what we do next has to be. Then in a moment, no one saw coming. Someone stood up in the back. It was Eli Ross, the younger, brother of one of Chase Deloy's friends. His voice cracked as he spoke. My brother was there that day. He laughed. I'm not him, but I live with what he did. He looked directly at Len. I'm sorry. I know it's not enough, but I needed to say it in front of everyone. Len didn't respond. Not right away. But as the meeting ended, as people began to file out into the dusk, Len walked slowly with the ache of years in his. Bones over to Eli. He didn't reach out. He didn't speak. He just stood there and nodded. That night, Santa Fe was quiet. Not the quiet of repression, but of digestion. A city chewing on its conscience. The echoes were still in the dust. In the streets, in the bricks outside the diner, in the grooves of the bench where a man had once bled and no one moved. But they were different now. Not silent, just waiting. Because sometimes what matters most isn't the noise a story makes when it breaks. It's what people do with the silence it leaves behind. The first time the city of Santa Fe officially invited Len Booker to speak, he said no, not out of bitterness or pride, but because something in him still didn't. Trust applause. It had taken decades to stop flinching at silence. Now cheers felt just as sharp. So when Desmond knocked gently on his father's door and said, they want to name the plaza after you, Len just stared through the window at the place, where a slap had once landed harder than it should have. No one names dirt. He finally replied, it's the steps that make it matter. But things had changed. Not everything. Not perfectly, but enough. The town no longer looked away. And so one warm afternoon in early spring, people gathered not for a protest or a spectacle, or a reckoning, but for a remembrance. The plaque they unveiled didn't call Len a hero. It didn't list his medals. It didn't mention the viral video. It simply said in honor of those who stand when others sit still. He didn't speak that day either. Instead, he stood near the back of the crowd while Desmond took the mic. His son, dressed in pressed blues, spoke, not as an officer, not as a soldier, but as a son who had once watched his father bleed into pavement without lifting a voice in anger. My father never asked to be noticed, Desmond said, but life noticed him anyway, and when no one else stood, he did what he always has. He endured. There were no dramatic pauses, no flag waving, just quiet truth told steady. After the event, Desmond walked over and offered Len a folded piece of paper. It was a letter from the Department of Veterans Affairs. It offered not just apology, but inclusion, a place for Len's name and story in the New Mexico Veterans Hall, not as a soldier of war, but as a soldier of peace. Len didn't read it right away. That evening, he sat on the edge of his bed and opened it slowly. The words didn't carry weight, but the gesture did. All his life he'd served quietly, on ships no one remembered, in conflicts history barely taught, in streets where dignity came second to uniform and third to skin, and yet he had endured. That kind of honor didn't ask permission. It didn't wear medals. It wore memory. In the months that followed, people began to treat Len not like a headline, but like a neighbor. A teenage girl once approached him at the corner store and said, I read about you in school. He smiled faintly and replied, read about yourself next. That's where the real change starts. Desmond visited more often. Sometimes he brought colleagues from the base, young recruits mostly. They didn't come to gawk or to perform. They came to sit, to listen. Len would tell them what wasn't in the manuals, how to carry silence, how to walk through rooms that didn't want you in them, how to wear your name even when it didn't open doors. And slowly a new kind of recognition formed. Not national, not televised, but communal, local, one that didn't celebrate Len as a symbol, but as a man who had endured, something they could no longer ignore. The Red Crest never reopened. Its license was quietly revoked, not for slap, but for a dozen smaller infractions no one had bothered to enforce before. Its windows were boarded, its neon lights dark. People passed it now like a cautionary tale, evidence that silence too could have consequences. Desmond once asked his father if he'd ever consider leaving town. You could live anywhere now, he said. People would welcome you. But Len just looked out over the plaza where his story had changed, then turned back with a tired but firm voice. This is where they saw me. This is where I stay. It wasn't about claiming space. It was about not surrendering it anymore. That spring, Len began writing just short reflections, observations from A. Life spent listening more than speaking. Desmond compiled them quietly into a small bound collection and donated it to the local library. The librarian placed it on a table with a handwritten card that said, "Local author, lifelong witness." The book didn't sell thousands. It wasn't meant to, but those who read it began leaving notes in the margins, scribbled words like "thank you," and I never thought about it that way. And my grandfather would have understood this. That to Len was enough. Not the echoes, not the applause, but the fact that someone somewhere kept a story turning. And when strangers still came, tourists mostly drawn by the story, they sometimes asked, "Are you the man from the video?" He would nod one steady. "Yes," he'd say, "but that was just one day. I've lived a lot more." And then he'd tip his hat, adjust his cane, and walk back down the path he'd once been knocked to, not to relive the fall, but to prove quietly, defiantly that he had always stood back up in the quiet town of Santa Fe, where old buildings cast long shadows and some stories get lost in dust. One man reminded an entire community what dignity truly looks like. Len Booker was not searching for attention. He wasn't trying to become a symbol. He simply walked the same sidewalk he had walked for years. Same cane, same jacket, same quiet grace. But one afternoon, a shove changed everything. It wasn't just a slap to the face. It was a slap to memory, to sacrifice, to a history that too many chose to ignore. When that biker raised his hand against an 84-year-old Korean War veteran, he didn't just hit a man, and he struck the part of us that wants to believe we still know how to respect what matters. And for 30 minutes, the world stayed silent until it didn't. When Desmond, Booker Len's son, and a high-ranking special operations commander landed outside the bar in a Black Hawk with his unit. It wasn't revenge he brought. It was a reckoning. It wasn't just a show of force. It was a reminder that honor doesn't retire, that some uniforms may fade, but the people who wore them never stopped carrying the weight of their service. And yet, Len didn't ask for punishment. He didn't demand outrage. He sat on that bench holding his torn paper bag, his cheeks still burning, not from the pain, but from being invisible in the town he helped protect. What followed wasn't a riot or a storm of protests. It was something far more powerful in awakening. The community began to see what they hadn't before. They began to listen not just to what was loud, but to what had been silent for too long, not just to the man who stood, but to what he stood for. Through a viral video, through a hard conversation at City Hall, through moment of apology and accountability, a ripple formed, not perfect, not quick, but real. Len never wanted to become the face of anything, but his stillness, his refusal to shout his quiet strength, that became the very thing that shook the silence. Loose. A plaque was placed in the plaza. A book of reflections filled the shelves of the local library. And a town that once walked past him now stopped to nod, to wave to see. This wasn't just a story about justice. It was a story about recognition, about finally being seen for more than your years, your scars, your color, or your silence. It was about legacy, the kind that doesn't come from headlines, but from footsteps. So, what's the lesson we live in a world where it's easy to look away, to assume someone else will speak up, to scroll past disrespect and think it's not my place? But if Len Booker's story teaches us anything, it's That honor isn't loud. It doesn't beg to be noticed. It walks. It shows up. And sometimes it sits quietly on a bench until the world remembers what it forgot. And Desmond's presence reminds us we don't protect the past by erasing it. We protect it by showing up for those who still carry it. In our lives today, we all pass people like Len. Maybe they don't wear a uniform. Maybe they don't ask for help. But respect isn't earned by noise. It's earned by living, serving, enduring. So if the story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, maybe even feel something you hadn't felt in a while, then don't let it end here. Hit the subscribe button. Leave a comment with the word honor to let others know you believe respect should never be optional. Share this story so it keeps echoing beyond the screen. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more reminders of what still matters.